Hey kids, History Channel guy here. So if I wanted to lose all of my subscribers and make the most boring video possible, what would I do it on? Would it be on the history of rope? Well, no kids, I'm going to do it on the ethnic tensions of Sri Lanka. Yeah. So if you're interested in that, keep watching. But if not, this is based on an academic paper I wrote, and I honestly just wanted to get a video out of the time I spent writing it. Okay, so here we go. Part 1. The lead up to the Civil War. Like much of South Asia, Sri Lanka was a former British colony. In the 1800s, the United Kingdom used Sri Lanka as an epicenter for cash crops. Along the way, British brought thousands of Indian Tamils to work on plantations, but British favoritism did not end with agricultural jobs. The British quickly built schools in Tamil-majority northern Sri Lanka and began to appoint Tamils to bureaucratic positions. Mixed with the already present missionary schools, which were in majority Tamil areas, and suddenly, the Tamil minority would start to acquire most high-level bureaucratic positions. This tactic of divide and rule was not unique to Sri Lanka. The British used similar tactics in Sudan, while nations such as Belgium used it in the Congo. However, the favoritism for the minority deeply enraged the Sinhalese majority, resentment so strong that it would seep into Sri Lankan independence. Immediately following independence, the Sinhalese majority began to pass laws discriminating against the Tamils. Initially, this discrimination came in the form of limiting rights of Indian Tamils. In 1948, Sri Lanka passed the Ceylon Citizenship Act, which blocked Indian Tamils from becoming citizens. Immediately, this made over 700,000 Indian Tamils non-citizens. Yet, there's not that much backlash from the Sri Lankan Tamils, as these Indian Tamils were mostly from lower castes. Unfortunately, the Sri Lankan Tamils helped sign their own death warrant, as the Ceylon Citizenship Act set the precedent that the Sinhalese extremists could get away with discriminatory actions. Language has also been a tool used by the Sinhalese to enact power over the Tamil minority. Initially, English was declared as the official language of Sri Lanka. This was despite having very few English speakers in the country. Immediately, both Tamil and Sinhalese leaders proposed that both Sinhala and Tamil would replace English as the national language. Yet, despite the initial effort to make both languages the official language, Sinhalese nationals successfully made Sinhala the official language of Sri Lanka. This immediately put Tamils at a disadvantage, as government texts and documents were now written in Sinhala, a language most Tamils had no familiarity with. Contrary to the Sinhalese majority, the move greatly built their political power, as citizens regardless of ethnicity would now need to learn the new official language. What makes the situation even worse is many Tamil Sri Lankans voted for what would be their eventual doom. In 1952, the Sri Lankan Freedom Party campaigned on a ticket that advocated for the Sinhala and Tamil. However, after being elected in 1956, the party quickly switched to Sinhala only. The same thing happened with the United National Party, who realized that the only way to gain electoral power was to eliminate their two-language policies and switch to Sinhala only. These political parties lied their way into office, then officially switched the language in the, quote, and this is a terrible name for it, the Official Language Act of 1956. Even worse is that throughout the 1960s, under Prime Minister, I'm going to butcher this, sorry, Simarmavo Bandaranaike's regime, the federal government nationalized missionary schools. Immediately, the language taught in these schools changed from English to Sinhala, which made it extremely difficult for Tamil children to attend. Overnight, Tamil and Sinhalese children found themselves divided based on linguistic grounds, which only exacerbated the already building animosity between the two factions. Over the following decades, many of the former Tamil civil servants found themselves unemployed and struggling to get ahead. Simultaneously, due to new restrictions, Tamils were unable to succeed economically. Still, it was not until 1970 when things got worse for the Tamils. In 1970, the Sri Lankan government banned Tamil media and literature from Tamil Nadu in India. Immediately, this made it increasingly difficult for Tamil students to study abroad in Tamil Nadu, while simultaneously, the Sri Lankan government ended entrance exams to get into the University of London. According to the government, these acts were to help Sri Lanka become a more self-sufficient nation. Yet, to many Tamils, This looked like the government intentionally undermining their own educational opportunities. Though this act might seem small on the surface, to many Tamil politicians, the elimination of Indian Tamil literature began a multi-decades culture war that still exists to this day. Less than a year after the literature ban, the Sri Lankan government made another attempt to undermine Tamil educational opportunities. In 1971, Sri Lanka initiated the Universities Act, which limited the amount of seats available for university based on language. The government's reasoning for the law was during British rule, the only way to acquire higher education was through English. Due to the American Ceylon mission being in a primarily Tamil city of Jaffna and the other primarily Tamil regions, a majority of the English-educated Sri Lankans came from the Tamil minority. To the Sinhalese government, this was an act of evening out the playing field set forth by the British. Unfortunately, this act had adverse effects on the Tamil population, since, due to the new government quotas, only a limited number of Tamils could receive higher education, while it also ensured that the Sinhalese would make up the majority of high-level positions. After a few years of these discriminatory laws against the Tamil community, many Tamils felt the only option was to establish an independent state. In 1977, I'm going to butcher this again, the Vattuday resolution was a resolution to create an independent Tamil state in Sri Lanka's northern province called Elam. This was proposed by the Tamil United Liberation Front, or TULF. The TULF immediately became very popular in the Tamil community and won most of the Tamil seats. However, for proposing separation, the TULF party was banned from parliament. This group later led to the rise of the infamous Liberation Tigers of Tamil Elam, or LTTE. Part 2. The Sri Lankan Civil War. As shown by the evidence above, tensions between the Tamils and Sinhalese were boiling for decades, but actual violence between the two did not take place until 1983, when ethnic riots broke out in Colombo. During the riots, the LTTE killed 13 Sinhalese Sri Lankan soldiers. This led to thousands of retaliation attacks across the nations by Sinhalese against their Tamil neighbors. Almost 3,000 Tamils died in the attacks, which promptly led to thousands of refugees fleeing to Tamil majority regions of the country. Soon, the LTTE declared war on the Sri Lankan government, which officially started the First Elam War. The LTTE's initial goal was to establish a Tamil-only state in northern Sri Lanka, which would be named Elam. Over the next few years, the LTTE would use guerrilla tactics to fight Sri Lanka's government. But it was not until 1987 that war took a major turning point. Facing their own risk of Tamils separating from India and not wanting loads of refugees coming from Sri Lanka, Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi sent 100,000 troops to Sri Lanka. Despite the overwhelming Indian forces, the LTTE refused to surrender and immediately started to use child soldiers and suicide bombers to attack Indian troops. In 1990, the Sri Lankan president, I'm going to butcher this, sorry, Ranasijis Predasa, let's go with that, forced Indian troops out of the country, and a year later, Rajiv Gandhi was killed by a female Tamil suicide bomber. Just 2 years later, President Premadasa, sorry y'all, I suck at this, would be assassinated in another Tamil suicide bombing. I think it's hilarious that I wrote this paper, but I can't pronounce like half the words. The war would rage on for decades as the LTTE would conduct numerous guerrilla warfare tactics against the Sri Lankan government. It was not until 2001, when the United States declared a global war on terror, that the LTTE started to slow down their attacks. Months later, the Sri Lankan parliament switched to a pro-peace party, which led to a ceasefire between the Sri Lankan government and the LTTE. Unfortunately, the peace was barely held. In 2003, the LTTE declared themselves as the rulers of the northern province of Sri Lanka. Immediately, Sri Lanka declared a state of emergency and went on the offensive against the LTTE. It was not until 2009 that the Sri Lankan government officially announced that they won the war against the LTTE. After the conflict, the United Nations declared the war to be a bloodbath, and the LTTE stated that, and I quote, "This battle has reached its bitter end." Part 3. Religion in Sri Lanka. One aspect that's rarely discussed when investigating religion in Sri Lanka is the religious meaning of the island has to Buddhists. In one of the key religious texts, the Mahavamsa, the Great Chronicle, as it's also translated to, it is told that Buddha chose Sri Lanka to be the preservation site for his teachings, and how the island's duty was to promote his teachings. Within the Great Chronicle, Sri Lanka is referred to as the Singhadpa, which translates to the island of the Sinhalese. Moreover, the text goes on to say how Sri Lanka is a Dhammadipa, which means the island containing Buddha's teachings. These two passages have been used by Buddhist extremists to justify their actions. As to these majoritarian leaders, their policies are simply trying to preserve the legacy of Buddha's teachings. These passages are even cited as evidence for why Buddhism deserves special status in Sri Lankan parliament. In the constitution, it says, "The state shall give to Buddhism the foremost place, and accordingly it shall be the duty of the state to protect and foster the Buddha Sasana." Despite one's initial reaction to reading the previous paragraph, Sri Lanka is a much more multicultural nation than one would expect. Other than the 10,000 Buddhist temples, Sri Lanka also has 5,000 Hindu temples, 2,500 Christian churches, and a respectable Muslim population. Unfortunately, as a result of Buddhism being enshrined in the constitution, this has led to other religions not to receive the same protections under the rule of law. For instance, a Sri Lankan Supreme Court decision has declared that there was, and I quote, "no constitutional guarantee to allow the propagation of a religion via solicitation and police, therefore could not be pressured to investigate instances pertaining to anti-Christian activities stemming from solicitation." Moreover, the court went on to say only Buddhism and no other religion qualified for state protection. Ouch. I have already discussed the discrimination against the Tamil population in Sri Lanka, but due to majoritarian politics, radical Buddhists have also discriminated against Christians and Muslims. For instance, in 1978, the Sri Lankan government changed the constitution to state, "It shall be the duty of the state to protect and foster Buddha." This has led to courts to overextend their protection of Buddhism to not only religion, but also include properties, shrines, statues, temples, material objects, and geographic spaces. The ambiguity of the term geographic spaces has led to whole villages being protected under the Sri Lankan constitution, meaning other religions present in the area are seen as a violation of the Great Chronicle. Furthermore, this clear favoritism from the Sri Lankan government has emboldened religious fanatics who believe that non-Buddhists inhabiting Sri Lanka are there because of their generosity, and therefore should not make unrealistic demands. Of course, those, quote, unrealistic demands are things such as equal protection under the Constitution, but to religious extremists, this is too far. Unfortunately, Sri Lankan Sinhalese theocratic beliefs do not end with limiting religious protection. To many religious extremists, anyone who is a non-Buddhist can be considered a traitor to Buddha. Some of these supposed traitors are political associations, journalists, politicians, or frankly anyone who speaks out for minority rights. Sinhalese extremists even believe when foreign countries speak out against majoritarian practices in Sri Lanka is out of jealousy and a global conspiracy to undermine Sri Lanka, as the island is a holy land for Buddhism. Does this sound familiar, anyone? Hashtag what we've heard by a bunch of crazy people in the United States. Obviously, these claims have no grounding in reality, but to Buddhist extremists, the Great Chronicle is considered infallible. Therefore, all cruel actions are justified. One Buddhist monk even stated in an interview, "This is a Sinhala Buddhist country. We have a Sinhala Buddhist culture. This is not Saudi Arabia. Therefore, you must accept the culture and behave in the manner that doesn't harm it." As hinted earlier, harm it refers to anyone who does not practice Buddhism, who they believe are detrimental members to society. Ouch. So what are these cruel actions? I've already hinted that vast discrimination against Muslims and Christians are happening daily, but what is the extent of this cruelty? To start, if it were up to religious extremists, no other religion would be present in Sri Lanka. Many Buddhist monks believe that Christians, Muslims, and Hindus have their holy land, which would be better locations for them to leave. Obviously, these monks do not consider the ethical or social ramifications of forcing Christians, Hindus, and Muslims into regions they're foreign to, but frankly, they don't care, considering they just want to purify their holy land. Not that it has been established that many Buddhists in Sri Lanka want the nation purified from other religions. What have they done to show this animosity? When it comes to Christians, there are dozens of reports of priests being stoned, beaten, and even churches being burnt down. Additionally, whenever Christians are being served at restaurants, government buildings, or hospitals, they report delays, harassment, or not being served at all. It does not end there, though. Christians in Sri Lanka face constant harassment, including threats to their lives, Buddhists not allowing them to live in their neighborhoods, and being denied burial rights. The extent of these issues have been exacerbated by coronavirus, where doctors refuse to treat non-Buddhists, and funeral homes deny Christian services. Christian discrimination has even received attention from the U.S. State Department, which stated, quote, in multiple instances, police reportedly failed to respond or were reluctant to arrest or pursue criminal cases against individuals instigating attacks on religious minority sites. Legal experts with experience representing minorities with discrimination claims also noted that the persecution of perpetrators was rare. Despite the horrid conditions many Christians live in it is arguable that Sri Lankan Muslims have it much worse. Islamophobia is rampant in Sri Lanka, and mosques are targeted by Buddhist extremists who see Muslims as inferior. The most prominent anti-Muslim in Sri Lanka is the Buddha Bala Sena, BBS. According to the BBS, Muslims are solely responsible for undermining Buddha's progress in Sri Lanka. The claim is obviously ludicrous, but has been promoted by state-sponsored television, which gives it legitimacy. Worse yet, the BBS has agreed to join forces with Burma extremists and help them with the genocide in Myanmar, all in the name of protecting Buddhism. Some of the tactics used in Myanmar include setting up Muslim-free areas and preventing Muslims from freely moving throughout the country. Sri Lanka is yet to enact these draconian policies, but the fact that the BBS has gained so much legitimacy shows how fragile the current situation is. The popularity of the BBS should not go unstated, and frankly, we should not be surprised when Myanmar's discriminatory practices are enacted in Sri Lanka. Part 4. Solutions in the Unitarian government model. On the surface, it would seem that Sri Lanka is doomed for failure. However, I still believe there is hope if one keeps in mind Sri Lanka's original history, and if Sri Lanka switches to a federal system. After British colonization, Sri Lanka adopted a parliamentary model, which on the surface should give Sri Lanka the same democratic system as the United Kingdom. Initially, both the Tamils and Sinhalese agreed on the same prime minister, and a group called the Elite Pack, who was dedicated to drafting out provisions for independence. Despite being a Sinhalese leader, the prime minister preached unity between the ethnic groups, and he was seen as a unifying figure, and for a few years, it seemed that there would be unity between the Sinhalese and Tamils. However, the first major misstep came when the commission failed to include protections for the Tamil minority in the Sri Lankan constitution. Moreover, the prime minister unexpectedly died, which paved the way for ethnocentric politicians to emerge on both sides. The issues with majoritarianism do not end with early constitutional missteps. It can also be explained with Sri Lanka's reliance on a Unitarian government system. As mentioned earlier, Sri Lanka adopted England's parliamentary system, which itself relies on a unitary system. On the surface, this seems to work well for democracies with very few ethnic groups. Japan, England, and France are excellent examples of this phenomenon. However, unitary systems' flaws are immediately evident in countries with strong ethnic differences, such as Sri Lanka. Those Sinhalese make up 74% of the population. In Sri Lanka's northern province, 93% of the area is Tamil. In a federal model, the northern Tamils would be given the right to elect members using single-member voting districts and would be given their own autonomy via micro-state control, much like what we have in the United States. Yet, in Sri Lanka's current model, members of parliament are elected by proportional representation, and all laws are made by the federal government. This has made it increasingly difficult for voters in majority Tamil areas to get adequate representation, as they're still at the mercy of the majority. Worse yet, since there's no autonomy at the state level, this has meant that all political decisions are made by the Sinhalese, often without the support of the Tamil minority, who are unable to have any electoral power due to the Unitarian nature of the country. The want for a federal system is still present in Sri Lanka to this day. And the Federal Party of Sri Lanka currently holds 10 seats in parliament, but their electoral power is completely being hindered by the current unitary system. Either way, equal Tamil representation cannot be achieved unless a federal system is put into place. So, that is the history of the ethnic tensions in Sri Lanka. And let me know what you guys think. I have to write a lot of academic papers all the time, and sometimes it's hard to differentiate between my YouTube papers and academic papers, so let me know if you guys want to read a bit more about my academic papers and have more videos on them. As always, guys, thanks for watching, and remember to like and subscribe if you want more content. Thanks, y'all. Have a great day.